Welcome back, everybody, to me being mildly annoyed by the Wheel of Time. And this is the second day I am trying to read Lord of Chaos. Basically, the trend of yesterday is continuing. That is, nothing much happens because we have lots of time to fill, right? Yeah, I guess that's sort of the good thing of that is that I don't get like super annoyed yet. The bad thing is that nothing much happens. So let's have us a look and a talk about it, shall we? Cheers. All right. So we basically continue jumping around, and we are mostly focusing on, well, Rand some more. We're going back to Solidar with Elaine and Nynaeve, although we spent most of the time in the dream world, and we got a Matt episode, a short Matt chapter, and that's about it. Oh, and another one with Gang Evil, and Gang Evil sucks. I'll just say that. Yeah, so what exactly is going down this time round? Well, we get something that I found is interesting because I think it shows me once again what Robert Jordan is trying, and it shows why it isn't working for me, I think. And that's the next chapter. That was what was it called? A Sense of Humor. It's about Rand traveling to sort of somewhere close to Cairhien, or close to Tyr, even. Probably close to Tyr, I think. And talking to his army that is standing there prepared to march into Ilion. Although we get the distinct idea that they're just there as, the show. So Samael in Ilion gets distracted and something else will happen in the background. I mean, basically, I guess what will happen is that the Cairhien and Tyrian army, whatever army, will make loud threatening noises on the one side of the town, and Matt and the Red Hand are making threatening noises somewhere else, and then what's his name, Davram Bashir and Rand and gang will just teleport in and take Ilion. I guess that's something like what will happen at the end of the day. But we're not there yet. We will see. My point is that not much really happens there. There's, the world moves around. There's people rebelling against Rand. The idea that Rand isn't actually just a false dragon and not the dragon reborn, can't actually channel that kind of stuff. All those stories that Petronile is spreading have apparently taken root. And see, that's sort of the problem, not one of the problems that I have with this chapter. It is exceedingly long, and it does provide very little information. It gives us, in the grand scheme of things, it gives us the information that, yes, the lies that Petronile has been spreading are taking root, and there is internal, resistance against Rand in his already conquered places. That's the main information we get from this one. The other bit of information that we get there is that Rand has constructed an elaborate trap or elaborate diversions, distractions, whatever, feints around Ilion to fuck with Samael, and that's all the information we get in that chapter, right? It's a long chapter, right? It's like a 30-40 page chapter, and that's basically all we get there. So yeah, we once again see Robert Jordan taking a long time to say things, and that's not necessarily bad. I'll just say it again. That's not necessarily bad. I'm just saying the problem is that unlike other authors that have very slow-paced stories sometimes, Robert Jordan also has very little to say in those pages, right? That's sort of the problem. We have a lot of repetition again. We get all the descriptions of all these clothes of the nobles of Cairhien with all those stripes and stuff. We get that again, and I'm yeah. It is not vital information. And you've given us sort of a hint of that already previously in the same book when we spoke about it. Or, it comes again and again and again. And yes, I know this is like a new book compared to the last one, but he does the same thing here. Then we have, like, once again, like specific, facial distinction. It's like there's this one Lord, Tyrian Lord, and apparently he has a face like a potato, which also means a face like a farmer. Now we can ask ourselves, is it like, how fucking classist is it that you think that farmers look differently from noblemen in just their physical attributes, not their clothing? I don't know. I think that's kind of fucked up. But that's maybe just me. However, we've gotten this information at least for the fourth time now in two books, which are the two books in which he shows up. And that's a bit much. So we spend a lot of time with actual filler. And once again, part of that is, I guess, because Robert Jordan has a very tell, don't show kind of way of describing stuff, is that we just get like flat out descriptions that feel like boilerplate that he's just like kind of put in there to pad out his page count. So there's that side of what makes it kind of not difficult to read, but less, not very exciting. It's easy to just like blast through that because there's nothing really happening there. Then we obviously have another thing that is sort of weird. I will come back to that in a bit. Later on, we've also spoken about Elaine. That is cultures, because they don't work. But what I wanted to look at is this chapter is when Robert Jordan tries his slightly ironic, lighthearted tone in a way, with stuff like the ale scent of humor and Rand awkwardly trying to tell a joke, which is, I have to admit, really funny. But only the joke, really. And the problem with that is there's like descriptions in there that in like a different author, in say, depending on what you might want to read, a bit of like I don't know, Mark Twain, or like even Jane Austen or stuff like that, where you have that slightly ironic tone. Oscar Wilde would be another good example, right? It feels lighthearted. With Robert Jordan, it feels clumsy in these situations. It's like, because he doesn't manage to keep that tone flowing through the entirety of the story, so it only shows up from time to time. And when he kind of makes a joke that is sort of almost like an audience-faced joke in a way, almost scratching at what you might call the fourth wall there in a way, it just comes out of nowhere and you're like, what's wrong there with you, Bobby J? That doesn't work, really. And I think that's part of my struggle with it, that my sense of humor and my sense of irony is a very different one from what Robert Jordan does. It's like, I mean, I've said it before, like, you're Terry Pratchett, you're maybe, depending on what you're like, Michael Chabons, whatever. There's stuff that I enjoy. Douglas Adams, of course, as well, right? Sometimes even Neil Gaiman when he tries to be funny. Stuff like that, right? And Robert Jordan is just like, he doesn't do it for me there. And it's just like, I see him trying and it feels like a 14-year-old who has just discovered his first like joke. And yeah. So I'm not yet putting him on full blast for this. I'm just like saying he tries to do these kind of things in these bits of of story, when you have like the whole like scraping of those noblemen trying to be noblemen and whatever. You have these elements in there. They just don't really work because the overall tone of the book doesn't fit with it. And that's sort of why you're like, I'm like almost left scratching my head. I'm like, yeah, well, I see what you're trying to do there. It just doesn't work. The whole like difference between nobility and actual foot soldiers, the way how the nobility is like has no connection to reality, has lost touch to reality and ground in so many ways, even though circumstances are absolutely dire, is obviously a staple. Is obviously a staple of like a lot of military fiction and stuff like that. You can play this like by poking fun at the upper class and nobility, but maybe it's because Robert Jordan is an American and not a British, not an English person, not a Brit, so to speak, that he doesn't have like actual experience of that sort of like nobility that he's trying to portray there, because it is in a way a very European phenomenon, specifically British phenomenon at this point, and that's how he just doesn't like how he gets it wrong in a way. Maybe that's a part of it. I'm not sure, but I feel that he's just always slightly off with these bits and pieces. And yeah, so it's it's not really terrible. It's just like awkward to read. Now let's look at the next bit, and that's the Matt chapter. Now, there's a lot of things kind of weird with the Matt chapter, but overall I liked it because it kind of showed Matt actually trying to be something of a more rounded character. So I'm okay with that. It's like he's coming to terms with the fact that he knows all this crazy shit of like older battles and stuff. He's leading his band of the Red Hand, all of that stuff. It kind of works, sort of, I guess, as long as you don't look at the economy of the whole thing. But economy is something that Robert Jordan doesn't understand, so we don't do that so far. Now, what is interesting is, once again, like, this is in theory, in this chapter, nothing happens. Nothing at all. It's just like a Matt being more showing more character, and then moving to, put the other side of the feint towards Ilion. Because we also know that this one is another feint towards Ilion, right? So yeah, we have those two. And that's all the information in this chapter. And it's a long chapter. Don't get me wrong, these are long chapters. These are long-ass chapters filled with nothing, basically. This one in particular with a lot of dancing and Matt trying to flirt with serving women. And that just like was weird, right? Because, see, that whole aspect is another one that you can see in, say, fiction that deals with nobility or military officers who often at the time were also upper class and lower nobility. If you want to see a very like darker and more realistic, also more biting depiction, I guess. The chapters in the first in The Blade itself, the first law book by Joe Abercrombie, the chapters around Jezebel Dan Luther and also Colonel West, I guess, although I don't think he's an actual character, like viewpoint character in book 1, if I'm not mistaken. But those like young officers sitting around, getting drunk and molesting women, basically, which is a large part of what Jezebel Dan Luther does before he gets sent on his quest in before they're hanged, basically. Is another one of those depictions, which are basically how mostly British officers, but I assume also American military officers up to a certain point behaved, which is terrible, especially if they're in like occupied country. You're sitting around, yes, abusing local women, abusing local booze, and gambling. And that's, once again, this is a cliche, and this is a story that you've seen all over the place, and I get it. And I'm fine with it. What is weird is that all Matt really does is all about dancing with the girls and just trying to kiss her. And that just feels like weird, because what is basically depicted is at its heart kind of dark, because Matt and gang can just do whatever the fuck they want in that village because they're like an army. And all they do is try to kiss the serving girls, which romanticizes that kind of behavior almost in a way. Now, maybe there's some reasons connected with Robert Jordan's past as a soldier, but I don't want to make that accusation. I just think it's sort of, yeah, it's a lack of understanding in a way. Looking at it that way, but yeah, it romanticizes the behavior of men in power, that being in this case military officers who are also sort of lords. Most of them are like also nobility, because otherwise you don't get to be an officer in that sort of army, I guess. Um, Behaving atrociously, basically privileged. It's a ruthless display of privilege in all kinds of ways, and the way Robert Jordan describes it is basically normalizing and romanticizing that part. And I'm not going to say it's egregious here. It's yeah, it's something that you see with J.R.R. Tolkien and others as well, is like just how people of a specific age describe that kind of thing. I would argue that Robert Jordan, writing this in 1994 or 1995, something like that, I guess, should have known better. I definitely should have known better, but whatever. There's like nothing much else happening, right? There's like that long, like everyone is dancing until early in the morning, and I'm like, almost, is there like a dark agenda behind it? But apparently there's not, and they just like move away. This is, I feel, the other bit is like Robert Jordan now moving into almost like slow motion when it comes to plot. Like these are entire chapters that are like 45, like 50 minutes, almost an hour long as audiobook, and which I guess is like 40, 50, 60 pages, something like that. These are long ass chapters and nothing happens, and you're like, you start to sit back and become paranoid, like at least me. I was like, every interaction, are they possible dark friends? Are they something like that? No, it's just like Robert Jordan just has to put all this other crap in that doesn't mean anything. It's like, yeah, we see the sea focus going somewhere, and they'll probably, that part will probably make sense, but will anything come of the fact with the young boy that maybe tried to steal a horse or didn't try to steal a horse, and Matt giving him like a bath and money and food, and I'm like, that's nice of Matt. I'm good with that. But will anything come of that apart from like showing us that Matt is not all ruthless and not all self-serving? Also, why has he changed in that direction? Hard to say. But yeah, apart from that, there's just like a lot of fluff and detail that I guess a modern editor in like the 21st century would ruthlessly cut away, which is, when you look at it, exactly why stuff like The Blade itself, and especially later Joe Abercrombie books, work so well, is because they, like, Abercrombie has this like super tight style of writing where like that is pared down to the bare minimum, and this brings out the things that he wants to say in much starker relief, whereas Robert Jordan is basically telling a story here and is embroidering it and is like building it over with so much stuff that is unimportant that you can't even call it Baroque anymore. It's more like Rococo. It's so over the top in the way he does like drown his story in unnecessary details and slowness at this point. So yeah, that's what happens with Matt. I just, I like the idea of Matt getting a bit more substance, coming to terms with the fact that he is a good commander. We will not ask how his like army, on the one hand, as he says, has no plunder whatsoever because they haven't plundered anything yet, but how they can still like gamble and spend money all the time, the entire gang of mercenaries or army or whatever you want to call it. We'll not ask that one because I'm sure there's no actually good answer, because I don't think Robert Jordan thought that one through yet. All right. An interlude of evilness. Yeah. We got a chapter with Samael and what's her name, Graendal, and then we get a bit of Semirog, which, yeah, whatever. What can I say? They are not good. Evil is still not good. This one is like partly we're switching around, and I see what Robert Jordan is trying to do there, and I approve of what he's trying to do there, because what we see in these opening chapters, and I think we're still like sort of in the opening moves of this book. What he's trying to do is to show how the Dark One is playing each of the remaining Forsaken against each other, or most of them, right? Because we know at the beginning that Demon Dread goes to that war and talks to and gets like promised to be boss of bosses, which apparently is now called Nablis, whatever. Probably a game play on like Iblis, maybe, who knows. Point is, apparently he sort of tells every, and then we later find out that he made the same promise, sort of, or hint to Graendal, and possibly also Semirog, and maybe even Samael. We don't know. So we can sort of see that while they are running around to cause chaos and more chaos and more chaos, he's also, the Dark One is also playing them against each other. So that part is basically the only really interesting information in this long chapter, is that there's that. Also that he's, harrying them with his like uber Murdroll, who is, I almost want to call him the Mouth of Sauron, because his name is something of the sort, like Power of the Dark One, Hand of the Dark One, something like that, whatever. I want to call him the Mouth of Sauron. So he's the Murdroll who has extra powers, and he just like, I don't know, kicks around Forsaken for a hobby. And that's all we get from this. We kind of see a bit of like a more establishing shot of like the characters of Samael being like this military dude, and Graendal being very about personal pleasure, aesthetic pleasure turned to darkness, I guess, in a way, and compulsion and whatnot, and Semirog being all about torture at this point, being twisted, and I kind of I see what he's trying to do there, but once again I feel it takes way too much time for that. Like in a modern like book, not even in a like really modern book, but like even smaller book, like shorter books, you could like get the idea of like this establishing shot where you have like each character in like one page, in a typical interaction, and you know who they are, you know how they act. Good writers can do that like fairly quickly. But here we take an entire long-ass chapter to show us that Samael has sort of like self-esteem problems, because he's a bit smaller. He's just not as tall as Luther and Telamon, or now Randall Thor. So he's problems with his height, and he's like a sort of compulsive soldier and fighter. And yeah, all right. So he's basically Napoleon, I guess, is what we have to see here. Anyway, he has a Napoleon complex, at least, I guess. So we have that. And then we have the other one, what's her name, Graendal, who used to be like a psychotherapist who dealt with all forms of mental health problems. And then at some point when she decided to switch sides and get over to the Dark One, she just took all her knowledge of the psyche to, yes, use compulsion and enslave people for her own pleasure. And that's that. And we know that she's kind of supposed to be very subtle, but apparently she's not that very subtle. But that's sort of her establishing scene. And Semirog used to be a healer, and now she's all about giving pain. And we get a long-ass torture scene with her, which is like, sort of like, why do we need that? We don't need that torture scene, especially since it is a boring torture scene, because she uses magic. And remember what I said about magic in this world? Magic sucks in this world. She's like, so yeah, she stands there. She has her, like, spread-eagled in the middle of the room by magic. And she uses her magic to cut away her clothes and take them away. So she's now spread-eagled, naked in the middle of the room, floating in the middle of the room. And then she uses her magic to connect to the brain receptors in, the pain receptors in that Aes Sedai's brain, and stimulates them so she has pain. You know what? That does not sound scary to me. It's just like I don't see any action. All I get is basically someone spread eagled naked in like a very gratuitous position so I can watch them whatever. And that's it. And I'm like, yeah. If your point was to establish Semirag as someone who was trying to heal and then did not want to submit to the rule of the Aes Sedai or whatever, and then all of that switched into being evil, then yeah, go ahead. But you don't need to do that on like 20 pages with that one torture scene that doesn't actually ever get anywhere. Because at the end of the day, we don't even find out what she's asking the Aes Sedai. So there's like no information gain in that scene. So yeah, it's kind of... It's someone trying desperately to evoke atmosphere and failing miserably at it. That's sort of what we can see from this whole ass chapter. So yeah, there's that. And now we come to the girls. I mean, Elaine and Nynaeve. And yeah, that one's mostly about the dream world and a dream trip with Nynaeve and Elaine and a gang of Aes Sedai to the White Tower where they look at stuff. And yeah, apart from like another large torture scene, there's not that much actually going out here. Again, it's like we get more like situations where women are sort of mishandled, where we learn that a lot of women are still more and more relying on men to do stuff for them or to do everything, because Nynaeve, which is ridiculous, right? So Nynaeve, whom we have personally seen, stealing actual horses from the actual White Cloaks in book 1, in one of her first scenes when we actually have her as a viewpoint character, like the first, second or maybe third chapter where we have her as a viewpoint character. We see her steal horses, which is cool. Don't get me wrong. It's definitely one of her best moments. And now she's sitting in Solidar. It's like, oh shit, if I want to steal a horse, I'll have to ask Uno to do it for me. You know, like, what? What happened? Why can't you go and steal horses now? I don't know. You know what I mean? It's just like ridiculous, because suddenly Nynaeve, who is supposed to be very confident and all kinds of stuff, does not know how to steal horses. I'm not sure. Apart from that, the whole like depiction of Aes Sedai remains, I don't know, remains boring. They're like, or like not boring, but it's like, once again, it's like too crude. Characterizations here are like always too crude and always connected with like the visual appearances, right? It's like that weird thing that Robert Jordan doesn't seem to be able to establish like a behavior and character through behavior, but always has to connect it to how people look, which is, I don't know, old-fashioned, to put it mildly, like very old-fashioned in a way. So anyway, they go there to the White Tower. They read all kinds of stuff, who knows what, all over the place, and then they are trapped by a nightmare. And then we have all of the Aes Sedai and Elaine and what's her name, Swan Sunshade, right? That's the one. Being tortured by Trollocs in a dream, which could potentially be very, very dangerous, because you die if you die in a dream, right? And then they just like reimagine the reality of the tunnel, and then the thing, you know, the nightmare just pops away, and and they are kind of all safe, and then they get back to being humiliated by the true Aes Sedai, because that's just how these things work. And then we have another chapter that does nothing much but in elaborate detail, which is when there's that supposed tension rising, Nynaeve is frustrated. We get a long ass scene where Logain tells everyone how he was basically built up as a false dragon by the Red Aja, and so forth. And that is unnecessary. In any more modern fantasy book, you would not spend a long ass scene on Logain talking about that after having established that that's what his job is a couple chapters earlier in the same book. It may have been in the last book. It was in Fires of Heaven, all right. But still, it's you have established that his job is to tell everyone that to sow more chaos and mistrust against the Red Aja, mostly. And I'm yeah, whatever. I get it. But still, it would not fly in more modern fantasy books. It would be edited out, because you don't do that anymore. You're all right, Logain spreading information. Either you drop the first scene or you drop the latter scene. You don't have two scenes to do the same thing, because nothing comes of that. There's no further development in that scene. It doesn't do anything but show him do that thing. It just gives us not 5 pages, but an entire page of Logain just doing that. And well, whatever. Now, there's one or two things, I guess, that are still interesting before we leave it for today, because really, nothing much happened. The one thing is Elida. And I do actually like the way that every time they go into Elida's study, there's fewer chairs in front of her, big throne. And you have that dream sequence this time when she just pops up and is I have foreseen that I will unite the tower. And she's obviously getting more and more strict, seeing treachery everywhere. And I like all of that, apart from the how stupid are people in this book. Because Swan and Elaine both watch that every time, and Elaine is I have seen chairs missing. Every time I come back, there's less chairs. But I don't know what it means. I have no idea what it could possibly mean. Oh boy, this is willfully stupid. And once again, you can't blame Elaine for that. You have to blame Robert Jordan for portraying someone this stupid, because it's either he thinks she's that stupid as a writer, or she's I need to build tension here, and I have no other way to do that. So I'll just come right out and say, let her I have no idea what that could mean. Both are possibilities. I am not going to be the one that decides which one is true. But I mean, the overall arc of Elida as that character that actually tries to do the right thing, then breaks that fundamental rule, which is obey the order, believe the person in power over you. In this case, in the rank, which would have been Swan Sanche, the Armerlin seat. She doesn't do that. She takes over, rebels out of pure motives, and then becomes more and more paranoid and runs the entire organization into the ground. It's a pattern that we have seen in a lot of not only fantasy. It's it's a general storyline character arc that we have seen in a lot of stories, a lot of classic stories, classic literature, drama. You could probably make cases that it's sort of what you see in a bit in, say, in Macbeth and stuff like that, when someone takes over for what they believe are the right reasons, and then because they are not sure of that actual regal authority or whatever it is, the true king, the true ruler has had, because they don't have that, and they are like not officially, divinely sanctioned to be the king. They slowly go mad. And so, like, Macbeth is a classic example of that, and there's others out there that go in the same direction. And yeah, I assume we'll reach the point where she'll, get like humiliated and then like see the error of her ways, because that's sort of what we learn from that kind of story at the end of the day. Yeah. So there's that, and the final thing we wanted to look at for a moment here is cultures, because cultures in these books suck. I mean, we've spoken about that before. They're horrible, they're stereotypical, they're blunt, and they are inconsistent. Now, the first thing that I've spoken about before, and it's definitely something I will come back to again and again, is the use of national characteristics, right? Which is like, Carianan play the game of houses. They're treacherous motherfuckers, the lot of them. The Tyrians are sort of similar, just a bit less treacherous, but more arrogant bastards. The Domani are all wanton sluts, probably even the men. Although we haven't met any Domani man yet, so who knows. The Andorrans, on the other hand, are all a bit more bluff, a bit more honest, a bit harder to fool, a bit harder to fuck around with. They're like the good, simple English, or like American, whatever you want to call them. Like, you know what I mean? You ascribe characteristics that are then morally weighted. And they are clearly morally weighted in this book, which is why Andor is good. Cairhien needs white officers to lead them, and then suddenly it works, stuff like that. And that's like, once again, that's a base problem of all forms of racism and other aspects. Not only racism but general xenophobia, when you do a nationalism where you ascribe those characteristics to specific other groups of people. Plus, Robert Jordan also. Basically, I don't think he really knows how genetics work and stuff. It's like, yeah, so you have Cairhien and Tyrians who have been fighting each other forever and ever, and they're also like borders next to each other, but you can definitely tell that the ones are smaller than the others. They look very different, like physically different. We're not talking about different hairstyles and stuff. And while even that with like the national costume sounds a bit silly to me, the fact that, I don't know, I'm pretty sure that you can't, like, I mean, obviously there are people look different all over the place, but these are like basically two countries that are next to each other that behave very similar. They look very similar. They can't just say like, yeah, of course, everyone on this side of the border is 2 foot. It's like 1 foot taller than on the other side. That doesn't work, man. That just feels ridiculous, especially since, as far as I understand, these are pretty fucking small countries. We're talking all about basically one continent here. We're basically talking about one single continent here, with all these different cultures and all these different countries that are like wildly different, right? And that doesn't make any sense. I mean, even Tolkien was smart enough when he's like, yeah, we have like the Rohirrim, which are sort of these like super north-looking dudes, and on the other side we have Gondor. It's like, yeah, but the reason why the Rohirrim looks so different from everyone else is because they migrated there. They come from the north, and then they just moved there a couple centuries ago. Not even that long ago, right? Like a couple centuries ago. They just moved there. That's why they're different, physically different. But we don't get that in here. He's like, this has been like the same for the last 3,000 years. And obviously there's genetic differences between people that live like 20 miles apart. And that is why I think that cultures in these books suck. But yeah, so to sum this all up, not much happens. We get way too detailed descriptions that don't really work that well because Robert Jordan's not really that good at it. And in the background, we get like rammed home that the weather sucks because of the Dark One, but that's something that we've had from book 1 onwards. Just that it was like super cold last time round and now it's super warm. Maybe it's climate change. I don't know. We'll find out more about all of that tomorrow. And until then, cheers.